When you focus on your health, it's the gateway to everything you want to create in your entire life. If you want more energy, if you want better relationships, if you want a better career, if you want better positive moods, focus on getting healthy, and I promise the rest of the world opens up to you.
Welcome to the podcast again. How you doing?
Jesse, this is such an honor. I've been looking forward to this as the summit of every podcast because I've been doing quite a few of these interviews, and I know that this will be the ultimate in interviews because it's you, and I adore you. So thank you for doing this.
Oh, wow. We're going to have a lot of fun. We have a history of friendship, and we've done this a number of times, but it's been a while. And you have a new book out, and you're covering a new topic in depth, which is sugar. There you go, becoming sugar-free.
Yes.
So my question for you to start off is, why sugar and why at this time?
Well, sugar is the most inflammatory substance. When I look at it, it's just unbelievable the data that's coming out on how it ages us, how it causes damage, whether it's your heart, your brain, your joints. So I knew that as an anti-inflammatory nutritionist, this is the time to write about sugar because through what we just experienced, through this pandemic, how many people embraced emotional eating? And now if we can really recalibrate and find direct substitutions to that sugar, we can have all that pleasure and yet really have an upgrade and feel fantastic at the same time.
Well, let's start off on a personal note and talk about your history with sugar. Talk about how that's influenced your health over the years.
Well, it all started when I was 7 years old and I had profound ADHD, and my parents realized that sugar was the true culprit. So they read a book called, Dr. Feingold wrote a book called Your Hyperactive Child, and they realized that if they just took me off artificial sweeteners and artificial dyes, and certainly white sugar, that a lot of my symptoms would disappear. Within 2 weeks, my grades improved, my sleep came back. I had never slept as a baby, and I could actually focus. And so it was such a life changer that's really what started me on this sugar-free journey. But I did have a rocky road in my teens where the emotional eating cycle really got the best of me. So thank goodness I've come full circle and I'm back off of sugar. In this last 14 years, I let go of sugar for good, and I can't believe what it does for the brain and for the whole body.
Well, Julie, I know your family now is totally embracing the same lifestyle you do, and they're totally turned on to alternative health and nutrition and eating well. But at that time, when your mom came across that book, first of all, how did she stumble across it? And secondarily, how into alternative health was your family at that time?
We were not into alternative health. We were eating a lot of candy, a lot of hamburger helper, a lot of shake and bake, a lot of standard things. And my mom just lucked into listening to an interview on the radio. So let's realize that is like the ultimate. In the past, that's how people really got information. And thank goodness she heard that interview because it was life-changing. And she just went 100% in, and she gave it a chance. And she even made my own butter. She saw color on the actual label for butter and would actually churn butter for me. So I couldn't believe how dedicated she was. And within 2 weeks, she saw profound results, and the ADHD symptoms just went away. So I think that's I really hope people can hear that it can be so helpful if a child has a chance to get off of refined sugar and artificial substances. It can really change the brain because now we know it's such a neuroinflammatory agent that once it's gone, it makes such a difference.
And seeing such a profound change in you, Julie, and seeing that so quickly, did the whole family embrace this dietary shift? Or was it kind of like preparing Julie's meals separately and then the rest of the family would eat in their, old pattern?
It was like that initially, but eventually everybody got on board. Like my sister climbed on board, my brother, and I have to say now the entire family is free of refined sugars and actually gluten and other refined flours because actually flour becomes sugar right in your mouth within about 60 seconds of chewing. So now we're all off those insulin spiking carbohydrates, which is exciting to see a whole family embrace the lifestyle.
That's incredible. Let's take that a little bit further. You talked about how when sugar or when carbohydrates, hit the palate, there's that enzymatic reaction and things start to change. Take that even further. Talk about, Let's use white sugar as an example. We know this is the big culprit when it comes to sugar. So if somebody's say putting that in or on something, consuming that, let's talk about the physiology and how that interacts with the body.
So, when we take in sugar, we have a spike of insulin. And unfortunately, because it's refined, there's nothing to slow it down. So, the sugar ends up having an overreaction of insulin, which causes reactive hypoglycemia. So, people might think that they're having it for energy, but unfortunately, the insulin's going to shuttle too much of those sugars inside the cell, and we'll end up having low blood sugar as a result. And what's interesting is the brain is only 2% of our body weight, but over 20% of our energy needs. So our brain is so sensitive that the second our blood sugar drops low, it literally cries out for more sugar. And that's why we end up having this addictive cycle. Not to mention, it literally stands on your dopamine. So you're putting out so much dopamine, but as you eat more and more sugar, you end up having your dopamine receptors blocked. And that's why we end up having to have more and more sugar to have that same pleasurable feeling. So now they realize that sugar's pretty much as addictive as drugs. Like they've done brain scans and they realize, hold on, this is as addictive as cocaine. We have to be so careful with how much sugar we're eating. And the average person, gosh, we're being inundated with it. The average person eating like over 56 pounds of sugar per year. We've got 74% of processed foods with sugars. So how in the world do we actually change this picture? And that's what I really want to give people 25 beautiful alternatives to sugar so that you can have the pleasure, you can have the taste, but you don't have to have the hangover.
And when it comes to all this sugar, you talked about how much the average person is taking in within a year, which is just profound and terrible. But where is most of that coming in? You mentioned processed foods. Is it mostly hidden within those?
I have to say, I'd say close to half of that is coming in through sweetened beverages. And it's nuts to know that when we have even 2 sweetened beverages a day, it's been shown to actually age us 4.6 years faster, which is on trend with how much cigarettes age you. So it ages you from head to toe. When you actually have too much sugar, you end up aging the collagen in your skin. It glycates the collagen, and once it's glycated, all of a sudden you have deeper wrinkles on your skin. It actually causes major damage to your eyes. We can end up with faster cataracts. We can end up with sore joints because it actually glycates or damages the tissues within your joints. Your capsules are made up of that collagen. So once we glycate that, we end up with more pain in our joints. It even damages our kidneys. We know that's a real problem. And we can end up really damaging the nephrons, which is so important that we don't damage those. They're like little light bulbs that allow the exchange of toxins. And then the last part is our heart. We see 1/3 of people with that heart disease. So we got to really watch it because unfortunately we create real damage to our entire cardiovascular system. So we age from head to toe. And that's why I'm so passionate to have people break up with sugar in a beautiful way. It's possible.
Let's talk about how to do that in a healthy way. Say somebody's listening or watching right now and they're eating a standard type diet or they're eating, they've made modifications and they're starting to eat a little bit better. Where do they begin? That could be an overwhelming thing for somebody, who's got their current recipes and their current foods that they're buying at the grocery store. How do you recommend somebody begin all this?
Well, the big thing is to start actually substituting in things that are so similar that you're not going to miss the flavor. So I actually have this killer chart that shows you every alternative to sugar, and I show you how fast that sugar substitute will actually spike your personal blood sugar because we have a variation, right? We have true non-caloric sweeteners like monk fruit and stevia. Those are probably the very best because there's no insulin spike. There's no personal elevation of blood sugar. So that's absolutely glorious because you end up having actually an anti-inflammatory property to that. I love that monk fruit is also an antihistamine. So it helps to reduce allergic reactions, which is so cool. And so you can buy direct substitutions. And that is one of the easiest ways to have that flavor hit that you need, because a lot of people are like, I'm so used to this recipe being just the way it is. And then we also want to explore all those sweeteners that do have calories. Like, what if you don't need to break up with carbs? You just want to break up with the inflammatory white sugar. Then we would embrace the beautiful sweeteners. Like, did you know lucuma and mesquite and dates actually prevent the enzyme called alpha glucosidase, which actually causes the carbs to break down into sugars. So when you eat these beautiful sweeteners, you're preventing the carb breakdown, allowing your blood sugar to stay beautifully balanced. And that's why I'm so excited that we don't need to throw out sweet. We just need to throw out the inflammatory white sugar that's causing a lot of nutrient deficiencies and inflammation.
And you talked about a few foods there that we could use as sweeteners that would have that reaction that wouldn't allow, is it our blood sugar to spike if we include those?
Well, what will happen is that it prevents the actual more, it prevents the carbohydrates that are long chain, like the actual complex carbs, it prevents them from breaking down. So say you were to have a shake and it would have like pumpkin in it along with, say, dates. The dates would actually help prevent all the pumpkin from converting from a long chain carb into a simple sugar, and that's going to slow down the sugar. So that's what's so glorious is when you combine these holistic sweeteners, you're going to end up with that nice slow trickle of fuel. We want slow burning carbohydrates. Unless you're going to fat fueled, which we could get into, we want to have that real avoidance of high insulin foods, the foods that elicit a high insulin response.
And what are your thoughts about adding in specific supplements when you're having a meal that has carbohydrates in it to help with that blood sugar spike? Are there any go-tos that you have? If you know you're going to be going out and having a meal, say with friends, and it's a healthy meal, but maybe it's a little bit more carbohydrates, maybe a little bit more simple carbs, maybe some more healthy sweeteners than you're used to having, when you're making the food yourself. Is there certain things you can pack along on the go with you that can help with that sugar spike and that, insulin spike that's going to accompany that?
The best thing to do is to buffer your blood sugar by making sure you have beautiful fiber. So when you bring along, say, either some flax crackers, chia crackers, a little bit of psyllium to add to your water, that's going to slow everything right down, because those fibers work like a sponge. They're going to trap the carbs and then trickle them into your system slowly. So there are even soluble fibers that you can't even taste. They're perfectly clear in water, but we know they reduce the glycemic index of a food. So we can see that they're absolutely going to help you slow that sugar down. Because really, at the end of the day, our aging depends on us not spiking our personal blood sugar.
Got it. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And what about cane sugar? This is something I'm seeing all the time when it comes to quote unquote healthy, packaged products. And I know a lot of times, even myself, I kind of give it maybe a pass because, oh, cane sugar, that's better than, refined white sugar. So let's talk about, the impact that has on the body versus white sugar.
Sure, when we have sucanat or cane sugar crystals, then those are actually at least having some nutrition with it. You're at least having some B vitamins and a few minerals in it. So they're not as much of that debit card that white sugar would be, because when you insert just pure white refined sugar, you're going to need to cough up a lot of nutrition. The only thing to keep in mind is it's still spiking your blood sugar too much. So the glycemic index on the average sweetener like that is running around 60, 65. That's still too high. So what I really like to say is if you want to focus on caloric sweetener, it is better to reach for dates, because those are only 35 on the glycemic index. Or even if you reach for honey, is as long as it's raw honey, that can be a helpful thing, because it's actually pre-broken down by the bee. So the other thing of why I avoid all cane sugar products is because sucrose, which is the main sugar inside of standard table sugar, or cane crystals, as you're talking about, sucrose requires you to break it down. And if you don't have the digestive enzymes to split that sugar, that disaccharide, into its simple parts, then it's going to cause digestive bloating and inflammation. So that's why I love reaching for sweeteners that are either simple or they're already broken down. And the bee is beautiful for that. The bee actually has broken down that sugar into an easy to digest sweet so that you don't end up with gut inflammation from it. So we see honey, the raw honey, as actually very gut healing. And that's why we see it oftentimes in books where they're trying to heal the gut. Like if you've ever heard of the GAPS protocol for either brain inflammation or gut inflammation. That's why when I was a child, I actually could have honey sweetened fudge, for example. And that's why you'll still see some raw honey options in my book, because those actually don't seem to cause nearly the same problem. Absolutely.
And you mentioned there the fact that some of us don't have the proper enzymes in our gut to break these sugars down. How common of a problem is that?
I really have to say that it's more common than we think. And if people really gave it a chance, just think about how many people are dealing with depression. We know that when you have a high level of sugar, there was a great study showing that men consuming high levels of sugar have a 26% higher chance of suffering from depression. So if we really look at our inability to break sugars down and we get off of those refined sugars, but also move to easier sugars to digest, we may see a real resolution on a lot of mental health issues. And I also see it in reducing anxiety. How many people out there during this last 2 years have had ridiculous amounts of anxiety? And that's why I'd love to speak to a really rare and unusual sweetener that I've discovered, which is called Inositol, which is actually formerly known as vitamin B8. That is a wonderful sweetener that actually is about half as sweet as table sugar, but it has been shown to reduce panic attacks from 4 a week to 2.5 a week, which is a substantial reduction in anxiety. And that's one thing I've noticed. That's the reason why I decided to give up sugar completely, is because not only was I noticing that sugar caused my anxiety to go higher, but I also noticed just better moods overall, and my self-deprecation went down. So if you're dealing with severe PMS, if you're dealing with sort of that anxiety, that how can I put it, that real being hard on yourself and the terrible negative self-talk that comes with your blood sugar being too high and then too low, you'll notice a real breakthrough on your ability to be kind to yourself, which is important.
And Julie, from preparing for this interview and digging into, your story and your health journey, it seems like you're somebody who, even if you have a little bit of cane sugar, and again, if say you're at, a gathering and eating some quote unquote healthy foods that have, say, cane sugar in it, you're kind of like a canary in a coal mine where you talked about the effect on anxiety and your mood and the way you feel. You'll have that just after one exposure.
It's very strange, but I've double blinded this. I've had a reaction at a restaurant, and the next day I'm like, why am I feeling so poorly? Why am I feeling like people don't like me? Like I'm making up stories in my head. And it turns out that I'll call the restaurant and they'll admit that the sauce that I had actually did have cane sugar in it. So I'm extremely careful to avoid sugar. And that's why 14 years ago, when I read how dangerous sugar was for your mental health, I made a final decision. That's it. Sugar has got to go. And I haven't intentionally I have not intentionally had sugar since my honeymoon 14 years ago, because I felt like this is it. If this is what I really need to feel good inside my own skin, it's worth giving up a few minutes of pleasure to feel good, right? Because instead of having that 5 minutes, you can find pleasure in another type of sweet that's stevia sweetened or monk fruit sweetened and still have lots of fun, but also feel good the next day.
Yeah, that makes sense. Let's come back to the inositol. You quickly touched on that, saying it's a sweetener that we could sub in. I think you mentioned about half as sweet as table sugar. How would somebody include something like that?
It can only be used in beverages that are not heated. So you can't bake with it, but I love it in my smoothies. That's the best place to put it. You can also put it in like a lemonade. So you would squeeze a lemon and add some maybe sparkling water, and then you can sweeten it that way. And it's just absolutely fantastic. It also has been known to help reduce polycystic. The actual Inositol reduces polycystic ovarian syndrome and balances our hormones. Because that's what's crazy is sugar actually causes major hormonal disruption. So it's fantastic to have an option.
Well, one thing we're finding out, just early on in our discussion here is how quickly when somebody consumes sugar, at least somebody who's sensitive to it, can have, a profound effect in your early days when your mother took you, off of sugar and food dye and preservatives. Within a couple weeks, you're feeling a profound difference in your health. And now you're talking about, the canary in the coal mine when you're exposed to even cane sugar, you can feel that right away. You mentioned quickly before in your teens rebelling and turning against that diet that had worked for you, as a kid and really relieved a lot of your symptoms. So let's talk about that period of time. What happened and how quickly your symptoms came back?
Within weeks of really going whole hog, I actually started working in a tuck shop that had the cheesies and the brownies and the chocolate milk, and I started binging on it. And I started to feel absolutely horrendous. And my PMS was so bad, man. I could like become a dragon, let me tell you. And I had terrible breakouts and hormonal havoc, and double that with the pill. And my gosh, it was a nightmare. So I have to say that it took a long time for me to accept that they were connected, because emotional eating became a super crutch. When I was in theater school, I wanted desperately to be thin. And I would diet really harshly all week, and then I'd break out of food prison and do these 3 or 4 thousand calorie binges, like entire pans of cinnamon buns and Rice Krispie squares and insane amounts of ice cream with making chipwiches. And I would just binge and binge and binge. So anybody who's been there, like, no, absolutely no judgment. I totally get the emotional eating piece. But I promise you that eating that way is a form of self-harm. And what helped me break out was a whole lot of therapy and looking down at a food and kind of asking myself, is this food for self-love or is this food for self-harm? Am I actually angry at myself or at someone else, or am I resentful? And if I can get to the root of that, and let go, you'd be shocked at how your emotional eating drops away organically without forcing yourself to do anything. Because I really get how emotional food is, that it's not, you can feel very full and yet not necessarily be able to stop eating. So if we can get underneath the food and answer that question, what is this food fulfilling? What need am I getting met from this food? Then we can find a higher way of fulfilling that need from other tools in the toolkit of self-soothing. And then all of a sudden you don't need to binge.
And for you, Julie, you mentioned being in theater school and having this issue with, restricting calories and having bulimic behavior periodically. How long did that go on for?
Gosh, for years, at least a decade. And I did tremendous damage to myself to the point where my digestive function was horrible. Like I didn't have great hydrochloric acid production, and it made me very vulnerable to infections. And my candida was so high. Like, because you can't have that much sugar without creating a real imbalance in your digestive microbiome.
And how did you realize you had a candida problem?
Just having every symptom in the book, and thank goodness having a decent naturopath who said, Julie, you really have every symptom of candida. We need to rein this in. And then finding the right therapist who helped me unpack why I was eating to that extent, and I really encourage anyone with an eating disorder to get to a wonderful therapist. My favorite type of therapy is called EMDR, or eye movement desensitization and repatterning, because it helps you address trauma so that you can put the trauma safely in a part of your brain and label it resolved so that you're not constantly triggered and reliving it over and over again. And that's what was triggering my emotional eating, is I was having something coming up from my past that made me feel like I was in that traumatic moment. And now I'm able to stay more in the present and go, oh, that's behind me. I don't have to go back to that. And now that I've fallen in love with yoga and other self-soothing techniques, the toolbox is full enough that I don't need emotional eating.
All right. Well, that makes sense. And thank you for sharing that. I'm sure that's helpful for a lot of people. And by 30, you had your health back together. You decided to go on a big trip around the world and you end up on a small island in Thailand. Talk about what that experience. First of all, set the scene. What was it like there? And then we're going to talk about what happened there with your health.
So it was glorious, the sunsets and the scuba diving, and I was having the time of my life. But the problem was they only had electricity 12 hours a day, and that left the food in really poor shape. Unfortunately, I ate a pad thai that had unrefrigerated chicken and really suspect seafood, and it nearly killed me. So because I didn't have good digestive function, my hydrochloric acid was really low from all that dietary damage. I ended up having profound food poisoning, so bad that my fever spiked super high and I actually lost control of my limbs. So I couldn't even get myself to the hospital. Someone had to carry me to a nursing station because it was such a small island. There was no hospital. And the nurse was so scared. And she's like, I got to pump you full of antibiotics. And just in time got to it. And I was able to stabilize enough to transfer off that island. But I have to say, I was so scared because my fever was so high. I was delusional. And it was so strange to not have any control of my limbs. And I was very sick for a long time. I had post-infectious colitis, which caused arthritis and bursitis. So that's what caused me to be so inflamed from head to toe that I felt 60 years old. And that's why I wrote my first book, Meals That Heal Inflammation, was just being profoundly sick from food abuse. I really put it down to that because other people ate the pad thai and they weren't nearly as sick as I was. So I know that I was just really vulnerable.
Right. Were you traveling solo at the time?
Yeah, yes. But thank goodness I had developed a friendship with someone who took care of me. Thank goodness. I owe Sean a lot for carrying me to the nursing station.
And at that time, were you dating Alan? Did you have him back at home to take care of you when you made it back?
No, that's the crazy thing. When I arrived back, I was so sick. And by some miracle, I ended up dating Alan, who became my husband. And at the time, he said to me, what are you going to do to heal? Because I was sick all the time. Like my gut was just in such bad shape that, I couldn't even leave the house sometimes because I just was constantly nauseous and having profound colitis symptoms. I don't need to get into the gory details, but he got really strong with me and he's like, what are you going to do to heal? And I was like, I'll do anything, because I realized I wasn't just wrecking my life. I was really impacting his life. And that's what had me go, okay, I got to get this sorted. And in a dark night of the soul, sort of made that major leap into every bite from now on is going to be an act of self-love. I'm going to heal my gut lining, and dove into the anti-inflammatory world and did all the research.
And at that time, you mentioned the dark night of the soul, and your world was really closing in on you. Were you already a nutritionist at that point, or was that the catalyst to become a nutritionist?
I actually had just finished becoming a nutritionist right before my trip. So I knew that I had to double down on it when I got home because there was still a lot of emotional eating. So that's one thing I have to say is a lot of embarrassment. Like I used to hide chocolate chip cookies in my clothing hamper because I was so embarrassed about not being able to get it together. So if anyone's there, like, know that there's super compassion for secret eating, because that's really a sign of sugar addiction is the desire to do it alone. You just pretend that nothing's wrong on the outside, but you're doing a lot of damage behind closed doors.
And Julie, when you were feeling really low, your health was, in shambles at that point. What were some of the first things you did to start to pick yourself back up and start to feel better?
Well, one thing that I felt I had to do was find lots of ways to love myself. So I used to be one of these A-type personalities who would never allow myself time to meditate or have a hot bath or do any of those self-care practices. So that started to come in. But this whole piece of like, is this food going to love me back was a big conversation. And finding direct substitutions so that I could have fun and pleasure because I needed methadone to the heroin. I couldn't go cold turkey. Some people just go super strict. I knew that that was a path to binging because I had tried strict dieting. That's why I don't believe in diets at all. You've got to have a live it that really works for you. So that's what had me explore all the recipes. And now I have over 500 recipes that are sugar-free, dairy-free, gluten-free, that are fun and delicious, but really free of inflammatory ingredients.
So, Julie, you start playing around with these recipes and changing your health around and start to feel better. How long does it take to feel better? And then how long after that do you decide to write the book?
I'd say it was a couple years before I started really feeling great. Like probably about 6 months till I was like, there's something to this. I feel amazing. And then within 2 years, I was like well enough that I'm like, okay, I got to document this. This is so exciting. So I wrote like an ebook version. And then, but it really was within around 2 years, 3 years that I was like, okay, this is awesome. And I felt like I had the tools to put my feet under me and run. So I really want people to be kind to themselves in the beginning because a lot of people give up on it before it's had a chance to work its magic. Like, I don't know about you, but how many people have said to you, like, I tried the gluten-free menu. No, it doesn't work for me. And I'm like, well, the thing is there can be unfortunate cross reactions with things like oats or corn. So sometimes people don't realize that you have to kind of take out a lot of the inflammatory things just to check. And then you've got to heal your gut lining because your gut actually makes your serotonin. 90% of your serotonin is made in your gut. So until your gut lining's healed up, you're not going to have all that real flush of positive neurochemistry. So I really hope if people can just stay the course, then you really see a big, big breakthrough.
And for somebody who wants to heal their gut right now, they might be suffering and want to make the changes. You talked about eliminating things. Is that the whole solution to that, or are there certain things you add in at the same time to speed up that process?
Well, I really love embracing proteins that work for you. And now I eat protein 3 times a day. And that's been incredible. Now, I just want to say I was a vegetarian for 10 years, and not everyone is a great vegetarian. Like, I just want to give a shout out to all the vegetarians. Like, thank you for all the good work you do for saving the environment. Unfortunately, if your gut lining is very rough, if you have a lot of allergic reactions, I became allergic to beans, to legumes, all legumes, and then I developed a nut allergy. So without legumes and without nuts, and then I became really grain intolerant. So where am I supposed to get my protein from? It became really tricky. So once I let go of that vegetarian dogma, shall we say, and I ate to heal, and I kind of said, I'm just going to eat whatever I have left. I'm going to eat what I need to feel fantastic. Then I had this incredible revolutionary change in my gut because I was getting so much bloating and burping and problems from what I was eating. And then all of a sudden, those symptoms completely went away. So I have to say, I beefed up especially small fish because omega-3 is miraculous. Like, it's so profoundly anti-inflammatory. But omega-3 and vitamin D that you would get from small fish like mackerel, herring, anchovies, sardines, these little guys just provide so much goodness for producing dopamine, producing serotonin, that you feel fantastic on it. So that was like a real big piece of my healing. And then I leaned into a lot of bone broth. And that's what I get into with hot detox. Like, I love bone broth because it actually is really high in glycine, 10 times the glycine of other protein sources. And glycine really helps your brain make more GABA and helps you stop being anxious so that you can cope with more. So it just was brilliant for my ADHD mind, and I slept so much better. And then you also get this big pop of proline, which is going to help muscle growth. So any woman pushing 40, now I'm 50, we need to do anything to stop sarcopenia. Sarcopenia. So sarcopenia is muscle wasting. So having that beautiful proline, just all of a sudden I started to feel stronger because I can't believe how weak I felt. So between bone broth and small fish, and then of course eating cooked veggies, up to 10 a day. A lot of people are scared of cruciferous veggies lately. So I just want to say, like, if you're worried that cruciferous veggies might be goitogenic and problematic for your thyroid, it actually, that issue with the goitogen within cruciferous veggies is deactivated through heat. So once we steam down or lightly saute down those wonderful veggies, then we're going to be able to deactivate it and truly make it absolutely brilliant for you. So I absolutely love all the cruciferous. So, I eat tons of rapini and arugula. My gosh, cauliflower, everything just is fantastic, but well cooked. And I love it in my smoothies. I even make ice cream with it. So good. And then I'd have to say the other major one would be all those dark berries. So I really lean into any berry is pretty much my friend. Blueberries, cherries, raspberries just are on the daily, just an amazing way to satisfy that need for sweet without popping your blood sugar because it's so balanced.
You've talked about so many different great foods to include in the diet. Julie, I'm curious. Let's talk about what a day in the life of you eating would look like. I know you're big on intermittent fasting. I am as well. So let's talk about what that looks like. When are you breaking that fast? And then what would you eat throughout the day?
Sure. So I was an adrenaline junkie my whole life. So now I have to love up my adrenals because my adrenals are taking over from my ovaries now that I'm 50. So I don't fast as long in the morning. So I like to break my fast around 10 so that I can stop the cortisol response. So it's great for your thyroid and your adrenals if you kind of start eating around 10 and then I stop eating it at around 6. And that allows me that nice long intermittent fast. I'm going on around 1,200 days of intermittent fasting because I absolutely am passionate about it. It's just so anti-inflammatory. It's completely healed my gut and also just incredible for your brain. Like, I can't believe how clear-headed I am now. Anybody who is also worried about the fact that they feel constantly hungry, it's one of the rare ways to heal our leptin response. So a lot of people just never feel satisfied. And as a person who formerly was binge eating, I'm amazed at how much it helps. So on to when I do break my fast, I always break it with, I love having dinner for breakfast. One of my favorite breakfasts is steaming down lots of spinach or chard or something that's really easy to digest. And then having turkey sausage with that is one of my fast and easy ones. I also love shaved fennel because it's rich in anethol, which is profoundly anti-inflammatory. And I'll have lots of olives with that because as a lady with burnt adrenals, all that beautiful sodium first thing in the morning just helps to reduce my cortisol response. So don't be scared of sodium unless you have obviously really bad blood pressure issues. But oftentimes blood pressure is tied to high blood sugar. So once that's tied, you're often good. So then we go into the day, and my snack is often like blueberries or raspberries are great as a snack. I also love macadamia nuts because they're one of the most anti-inflammatory nuts of all time because they're really high in omega-9s, also known as muffas, which I think is hilarious. And then they're really low in omega-6s, which are more inflammatory. So those are my favorite. And we haven't had a lot of mac nuts. Let's face it, they're expensive. They're from often like Hawaii, so people tolerate them really well. And then at lunch, I really love having like meal-sized salads, big, huge stir fries. I really also like frittata, which is like a crustless quiche piled full of anti-inflammatory pesto. I make that pesto with either tons of basil or anything that's got lots of herbage in it because that's so anti-inflammatory. And then dinner, man, where do we start? Like just huge amounts of one of my favorites as of late is butter chicken, made actually with lots of coconut milk. So move over butter. I make it with that MCT rich coconut milk that tastes absolutely nummy. And the family just goes hog wild for it. And the funny thing is I can put that sauce together in about 10 minutes. And people just love that. And I put it over cauliflower rice, and my family will put it over quinoa, and the whole family sits down and we eat really beautifully together. And I'm super happy that now I have sort of a menu worked out that people are jazzed by.
It sounds incredible. And I know I've had a lot of your foods over the years, and they are incredible. Let's talk about in between those meals. Are you a fan of having snacks? You talked about macadamia nuts, olives. What are your thoughts on in between your main meals having snacks, or do you like to give your digestion a break in between?
Because I'm intermittent fasting quite a bit, I find I need to get all my calories into that small window, but I try not to spike my insulin in those snacks. So that's one thing I'm super careful of is I've all but let go of insulin spiking carbohydrate for snack. So if you're going to have a snack, then reach for something that is fat fueled. So like I have these faux chocolate cups, for example, that will not have any insulin spike. And that's so nummy because you're having a treat and you're staying satiated between meals. But yeah, that's because if you're down to, say, a 6 to 8 hour window, it's hard to go over that 1,600 calories you need to get up to what you need in a day. So I'm not going to lie, I do kind of lean into snacks. But I also just really love a good dip with, like, I have an artichoke dip. Artichokes actually trick your tongue into thinking everything you've just had is sweeter. Have you ever like had artichoke hearts and then sipped water? It actually makes the water taste like there's sugar in it. So I have artichoke dip with a ton of celery and I feel fantastic.
Cool. No, I haven't tried that. It,
I will
it
bring it next time I see you.
sounds great. And Julie, let's talk about in the morning before you break that fast. Are you just having water, or are you a fan of tea, coffee? I know a lot of people like to include different beverages during that fasting period.
I personally believe that we true fasting means no caffeine because caffeine will switch on phase one of your liver. You're actually going to be unfortunately starting the digestive process. So I do stick to herbal teas first thing in the morning. And I love having something that will nourish my adrenals. So I love putting nettles in the mix first thing in the morning because there's so many minerals. Or I'll have some great salt and trace minerals in my water so that I'm having those 65 minerals that light up my brain and really help me kick up my ketone production.
You've talked about your adrenals a couple times there and how they've been depleted over the years. Is there any specific supplements that you take, that go along with the diet that are helping build those up?
Yeah, I certainly love many of the adaptogenic herbs, and adaptogens are things that help you adapt to the level of stress. And one of my all-time favorites is ginseng. I'm not gonna lie, that's like my go-to because I just feel so energized and loved up with them. But you can certainly use, like if I reach into like one of the great berries, Schisandra is this glorious berry that has 5 tastes to it. So it's sweet, sour, bitter, astringent, And all of those beautiful flavors are so deeply satiating. It feels like fireworks in your mouth. But when you sweeten it with a little bit of monk fruit, all of a sudden you're going to have this delicious tasting tea, or you can make it up as almost like an iced tea type thing. And it's just fantastic first thing in the morning. So you can certainly put it in your tea as well. So it can be like a nice brew of nettles and Schisandra to truly help your adrenals to recover, because everyone needs to work on their adrenals.
So we've talked about a number of the natural sweeteners in your book, monk fruit, stevia. We talked about inositol. You have a thick section of these alternatives in the book, and we won't cover them all here, but let's give people some other options for people that are, maybe this is all new to them, or maybe they've tried some of the more common ones like stevia. But let's talk about some of the more obscure alternative sweeteners people might want to look into.
Another one that blows my mind is D-ribose. Have you ever tried it?
No.
Have you? No, D-ribose is this sweetener that actually helps to create more energy within your mitochondria. So it's amazing for people who have fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, athletes, people with heart issues, because it's going to help you make more energy. And with that energy, you feel so much better. So it's great. They're even noticing pain reduction. They're noticing better heart function. So it's really great that D-ribose is now available as a sweetener. Just make sure not to cook with it, because it is denatured if we heat it. Another one that's really fun is the mesquite. I love mesquite. I love lucuma, because that actually prevents that changeover in actually, we've talked a little bit about that, the fact that we don't break down the starches nearly as much. So when we add those to our smoothies, we're going to have a great time with that. And then another one that may surprise people is, well, we should talk also about erythritol for just a second, because a lot of people are scared of sugar alcohols. There's mannitol, there's sorbitol, there's xylitol. Unfortunately, those are laxatives because they create a great deal of movement. But erythritol is well absorbed and is eliminated through the kidneys. So if you are going to try a sugar alcohol, erythritol is the safest to try. And that's why it made the actual amber list. I have like a green list, which is like super healthy. On the amber list, you can just see if you're tolerant to erythritol, because that allows you to have a one-to-one sweetener. It allows you to kind of make very traditional things like icing and kind of candy and that sort of thing. So that one, some people tolerate well. It can be any sugar alcohol. We have to be careful with the liver. So you just want to watch that. But super happy that at least some people are tolerating that. And another one, if I could really say, wow, I have to say that raw honey is brilliant. If you keep it raw, it's going to be high in peroxide, which is going to kill negative microbes. It's really actually good for killing candida, which surprises people. So that's cool that the peroxide in honey, that's why it's helping your sore throat. And there's so many delicious raw treats that you can make with that. Yeah, there's so many great sweeteners. I'm like
A
wanting to
lot of
dive
great
into
ideas
all of
there.
them. Yes.
Well, let's talk about maple syrup. This is one that hasn't come up to this point, and I know that's one that a lot of people do consider healthy in the health and wellness
Yeah.
space. What do you think about it?
I love the fact that it's got good phytonutrients in it. Let's face it, it's a sap from a tree. But unfortunately, being high in sucrose, not everyone breaks it down. And it's also very high on the glycemic index. So it's going to really create that insulin response. And at the end of the day, longevity is all about trying to keep our blood sugar balanced and our insulin down. So it's not my go-to sweetener. Coconut sap, on the other hand, what's interesting is when we tap the blossom of a tree, of the coconut palm, the sap that comes out of that is only 35 on the glycemic index. So it's half maple syrup, but that's absolutely brilliant for the amount of nutrition that comes out of it. It's got very high B vitamins, incredible amount of minerals, and some decent amino acids. So that's why a lot of people go to coconut nectar, otherwise known as, when you make a powder out of it, it's coconut sugar, and it's a one-to-one baking method. So I call that sort of the intermediary step, because in my book, I say break up with sugar fast, and that's going on non-caloric sweeteners, and then break up with sugar slow, And some people just want to stay in that slow breakup and just get off white refined sugar and say that dreadful corn syrup. And in that space, we can certainly enjoy the coconut nectar because at least it's very nutritive. The only people who need to avoid it is if you have digestive problems. You may not be able to break the sucrose within coconut nectar down, and therefore we still need to move to the non-caloric sweetener. So it depends on if you have IBS or IBD. But for the average kid, like if you're dealing with a little kid and you're just trying to help them have better options, then coconut nectar is a good option for them.
You brought up corn syrup there. Talk more about that and why it's so bad. And what types of foods do we find that in?
So the number one place we find corn syrup is beverages. It's so high. And it's absolutely nasty to your liver because corn syrup is extremely high in fructose, and fructose has to be broken down by our liver. So because it all has to be processed by the liver, we can easily overwhelm the liver and cause non-alcoholic fatty liver syndrome. And that's why we have a whole bunch of people walking around who have never embraced alcohol, but still have this dreadful denaturing of their liver strength. And that's why we want to break up with high levels of fructose. Now, just to say, fruit is bound in fiber and is in such often small amounts that we don't end up with the same dietary damage. So the cool thing is when we have the soluble and insoluble fiber of fruit, it creates this beautiful mesh in the digestive system that prevents the sugars from being absorbed right away. And that's why it doesn't hit our liver all at once. Where a beverage that has no fiber, like we see in pop or soda, you will have it hit you like a freight train. And that's why the liver is completely overwhelmed and it causes such hormonal imbalance that we want to let go of corn syrup.
And to expand on that a little bit, talk about fruit juice. Because I think a lot of people, when they're making the switch from these other toxic beverages, such as soda, they might think, apple juice, orange juice. And again, these fruits, when they're in their whole form with the fiber, that's a different story. But talk about what that's doing to people when they're consuming these on a regular basis.
Unfortunately, when we remove the fiber from a fruit, we are going to have that really dreadful reaction where the fructose has to be broken down by the liver. So people who are drinking quarts of fruit juices per day, thinking they're doing themselves a favor, can really run into problems. So I say, hey, if you are going to have fruit and you want to have it in a liquid form, can you at least put it in the blender with all of its fiber left in? The pith of an orange contains so much vitamin P, which actually helps the transport of sugars. It actually helps, let me correct myself, vitamin P actually helps the transport of vitamin C. So you end up with this awesome real immune benefit when we have all the pith with the orange. Plus, we're having really beautiful fibers that work to nurture all the good microbes in your gut. And we slow down that sugar release. So that's why I really love actually peeling my orange and leaving as much as the white as I can, throw it in the blender, and then sweeten it a little bit with stevia and add some other wonderful things like some greens in there and create like a wholesome, thick smoothie. We really have to have all that good pulp. Pulp is your friend. When I see pulpless orange juice, I'm like, no, that's the best part. Don't get rid of it.
Vitamin P, I haven't heard of that. Is that something you've come up with for pulp, or is that an actual vitamin? Or
It's actually a formerly known as, so there's so many vitamins, like the inositol was formerly vitamin B8. So if you look at the original list, I actually have a really cool list of every single vitamin. All those missing letters actually had an original assignment. And after a while, they're actually not essential for life. So they're taken off the vitamin list because a vitamin must be essential for life. But I'm like, I think vitamin P is still essential. So I love just mentioning the fact that it's formerly known as vitamin P, but how cool that pulp, which is the bioflavonoids of citrus, is actually extremely helpful for vitamin C.
You talked about the liver damage that somebody could suffer from if they're consuming too much fructose. How would somebody know if they're crossing over that threshold and causing damage? Say they're just having a little bit of fruit juice, or say there's somebody who currently hasn't made switches and maybe they're having, a lot of maybe corn syrup still. Is there a way to tell, like, if the liver is being affected?
Absolutely. I would head to your doctor and ask for your liver enzymes to be tested because when we look at a full panel, the liver enzymes are really a telltale sign. If your enzymes are going up, it means that your liver is being damaged. Another thing that's super helpful, guys, is to consider for just 2 weeks wearing a continuous glucose monitor. I love this technology because it shocked me how many foods were spiking my personal blood sugar when I didn't expect them to be the culprit. One of the big ones was tapioca flour. You and I fell in love with these tapioca wraps, and we would like go in and like have these delicious Brazilian wraps, and we'd be like, woohoo, gluten free, free of allergies, right? They were spiking my blood sugar so high because that starch was turning into sugar within seconds of hitting my mouth. And because unfortunately I did some dietary damage, I don't have that nice blood sugar control that my husband has. So I realized that having this monitor really helps you understand for you what your personal triggers are. Because for some people, it's brown rice. For other people, it's potatoes. It's good to know what are your personal triggers because then they can go on the pause list, or if I'm going to eat that food, I better buffer it with protein, fat, and fiber to slow it right down so it doesn't cause dietary damage.
And while we're on the topic of fructose, there was this sweetener agave syrup that really hit the health and wellness space about 5 or 10 years ago, right when I was getting into it in a deeper way. Talk about what you think about that for one. And is the issue with it the fructose?
Yes, it's agave is from a cactus and it is extracted with black mold. And unfortunately, it can be very high in fructose and be very hard on the liver. But the other thing that I have a real problem with is that it can also be spiked with cheap corn syrup because a lot of it is imported from Mexico. So, similar to the problem we're having with olive oil and how it's often being spiked with really cheap oils, be very careful if you do use agave. Like a lot of vegetarians end up relying on it because it seems like a harmless sweetener that is truly vegan, but it's unfortunately often spiked. And that's why I have let go of using agave. If you are going to use it, make sure it's certified organic because there's field to table tracing with certified organic.
And Julie, for somebody who these alternative sweeteners, it's totally new information to them. Just so we can distill it down in a way that's not so overwhelming, what would be like two or three of them that people could start with, go to the health food store or order online, that would give them diversity? Because you talked about how different ones have different sweetness profiles and different ones are going to provide different mouth feels, and some might work better in smoothies and baking. So, for the newbie, what would you recommend to get started?
My favorite sweetener is monk fruit because it is profoundly anti-inflammatory. It reduces histamines and it tastes so darn good. It's extracted from a melon, so it tastes really fruity. So it pairs extremely well with things. So I'd start there, and luckily it's become very popular. So you can find it online or at most health food stores. Even big box stores are starting to carry it. But I really like the pure liquid because it's just the fruit actually expressed into a low calorie juice. It's only 1 calorie a gram, which is mind blowing to people. So that's my go-to. But if you can't get that and you want to still have some calories, you can make lovely date paste from just pureeing some dates down with some water. And that has just a 35 on that glycemic index. So it's only 1/3 of the actual glycemic response of other sweeteners. So just quickly for people that don't know what the glycemic index, think 0 is water and 100 is pure sugar. So you can imagine dates is just 1/3 in. So it's so much healthier for you. And then I really, for people who want to use stevia, stevia hides well behind sour things because there's a tiny bit of a licorice aftertaste. but it's so good behind cranberry and lemon and grapefruit. So that's where it really shines. And it's super inexpensive, which is nice because it's virtually available everywhere now. And it's available like certified organic, and there's even like vanilla flavor or chocolate flavor. So it's really diversified lately. And the last one I will give a shout out to, go to your local beekeeper and support them. Remember that bees actually pollinate 1/3 of our food supply. So we need to love up bees, and honey does have some lovely qualities if you can handle sugars, if you're not someone who needs to let go of all sugars and embrace producing ketones. We'll talk about that, I guess, but that's so I've got dates and honey in the sweeteners that do contain natural occurring sugars. And then if you need truly sugar-free, then the stevia and monk fruit.
And when it comes to the glycemic index, you explained it there briefly. Does stevia, I know it's really low on the index. Is it a zero or is it just,
Yes,
it is
it is a
zero?
zero.
Okay. I'm curious your thoughts
So is
on,
monk fruit.
okay. I'm curious your thoughts on using sweeteners like that because they're not spiking the blood glucose, but it's still having the same sweetness response in the brain. So it's an interesting thing where our brain's thinking we're taking something sweet in, but it's not actually having the impact on our body. Is that something you think about at all?
I do. The one thing that I think is really important is that if we buffer the body by having the fats, the fiber, and the protein along with that food, we don't end up with an over response. And we do need to give something. That's why I'm talking about the methadone to the heroin, because I find if we go off all sweet, then we're putting ourselves in diet prison. And we can't wait to break out of diet prison. I think we need sweet, sour, salty, astringent, and bitter in order to truly feel satiated. So that's why I do rely on these sweeteners, but I have dramatically reduced the amount and I make sure to put it in that buffer. So I really like using something called 3-food interference because that's going to slow down your whole need for carbohydrates if you have those pylons to prevent the crash.
Can you talk about how over time, when people start to make these changes, use better sweeteners, use less of these sweeteners, hopefully over time, the taste buds will actually change? Because there's probably people listening going, I can't imagine trying to sub out, traditional sugars or cut them way back. But, it takes time for our taste buds to adapt.
It really does, but I can say that we can speed it up. And I really encourage people to try bitter foods. So one of my favorite herbs for that is gentian, is incredible because when you have a bitter food and you think you don't like bitter, but let's face it, you love coffee, chocolate, tea, most of the foods that people love are actually bitter. They're just sweetened. So if we have a bitter food, that truly helps to change our taste buds radically. And we start to actually need less and less sweet. And then if we also add sour foods in, that's also going to help to curb it. Because things like acetic acid, which is in vinegar, has been really shown to help to keep food in our digestive system longer so that it delays the gastric emptying that allows us to feel full and content. It also balances our blood sugar. So with all of that, we feel so good. And then if we add in spices, so we have more cinnamon, which balances our personal blood sugar beautifully, 1/4 teaspoon is the medicinal amount, or turmeric or ginger, all of these beautiful things are also going to deeply satiate us. So it's about diversification of our taste buds because let's face it, we've been kind of raised on salt, sweet, salt, sweet. So if we put in the bitter and the sour, the astringent and the spicy, then all of a sudden our palate's like, oh, thank you. Now I feel content. I feel full. I feel ready to face the day. And you'll have better blood sugar. And with that, you'll have your willpower naturally show up. Because everyone's like, I don't have good willpower. And I'm like, actually, it's your biology. Support your biology and the willpower will follow.
That makes sense. You mentioned ketones there quickly. Let's get into that a little bit deeper. And we'll pivot into it talking back about your fast. Your daily fast. You mentioned breaking that around 10 a.m. Have you ever tested? Do you know if you're producing ketones by that point?
Yes, I definitely am metabolically flexible now. So because I do have a slightly weaker thyroid and adrenal health, I make sure to not push fasting too hard or go into ketosis for extremely long periods of time, but I'm able to go in and out of ketosis, which allows me to actually burn off any excess weight. And now I'm actually the weight I was in high school. And that's hard when you're 51. So, for anybody out there who feels like they're resistant to weight loss, we actually have to help you manage your insulin levels, because insulin is a megaphone that says to the body, put this energy that's not being used into storage. But to cough up your energy back into being used again, you have to make more glucagon. And it's like glucagon is like a lost hormone. Why don't we shout it from the rafters? Like, we need to switch on glucagon by allowing ourselves to rest our insulin. So if we can allow ourselves to have time without a strong insulin response, then we produce our actual glucagon from the alpha cells in our pancreas, and that is the hormone of fat burning. So for the first time, I was able to access the deep fat burning hormone. And that's what allowed me to get into better shape in my 50s than I was in my 30s. So you can get there, guys. We just have to really rest insulin, stop spiking insulin, and you can access that golden hormone that everyone's like, oh, how do I get there? It's totally possible.
I love that you're bringing this up. It's so important because even if you're somebody that is eating healthy foods, but maybe you're snacking throughout the day and constantly spiking that insulin, it's kicking you out of your fat burning zone. So, if people are struggling with their weight and wondering, I'm trying to watch what I eat, how much I eat, but they're constantly spiking their insulin, they're never going to be able to burn that fat.
You got it. You got it. Absolutely. And then if you put in the mix the amount of stress that we've all been through and our cortisol's going through the roof, can we find ways to help pull down our cortisol response and also help make more glucagon so that we're just in this great space to get into the best shape of our life? We want an Olympic life, right? So that we can feel incredible. That's why you started the Ultimate Health Podcast. I think is the best name ever.
And Julie, earlier you mentioned the fact that you don't want to extend your fast because the cortisol spike and you want to be gentle on the adrenals. Talk about the physiology there. If you were to extend that fast and say go till noon or one, what happens with cortisol?
Well, the cortisol does go up as you are running out of fuel. But I will say that now I've adapted. So you just need to go easy in the early days. And now I can go 16 hours, even 18 hours. And you can feel it. Like when you start to feel wired and you feel that kind of anxious feeling, gosh, it's time to break the fast. But you'll notice how your body adapts over time and it just becomes elegant to fast and you get really clear headed. So know that my sister, who's actually 55, she is incredible at fasting. She can now fast for a couple days without that negative stress response. So it's just in the early days of adapting, because once you go into a good fast, your ketone production kicks up. So your liver is able to make your own ketones in the absence of glucose. And that's when you have the secondary fuel source. You're like a hybrid car. You can either burn sugars, but you can also burn your own ketones. And that's where you feel lit up and your brain loves the feeling of being on ketones. And that's why people who are either fasting or embracing the ketogenic menu will notice this incredible awakening where they're so sharp and they feel really positive. Some people feel just great on that menu.
And Julie, these days, are you including the exogenous ketones on top of fasting?
Sometimes I am, and I'm not going to lie, sometimes I want to extend that feeling of fasting, but I do break the technical fast of a water fast. But will definitely use beta hydroxybutyrate, which is profoundly anti-inflammatory. And the reason why I love BHB is it also kicks up my GABA production so that it quells any sort of anxiety. So I'm not going to lie, I'm flying on BHB right now because I'm talking to the top podcaster of Canada and I needed my brain to be working.
Well, Julie, we've covered quite a bit of your health journey here, and I want to fast forward to 2016. It was the winter time. at this point, you're a well-known nutritionist, you've written all these books, and you feel like your health's in a good place. But something happened, and I wanna talk about that story because I think this is something that could happen to a lot of other people, and it's important we cover it and get the education out there.
Unfortunately, I actually had a cardiac event. My cardiologist feels that I'm most likely had a SCAD, which is a hormonal heart attack. And that happened because I tried going on bioidentical estrogen because I was in my mid 40s and I felt like, oh, I don't want to have any cliff of falling off the estrogen cliff that so many women experience. So, unfortunately, I carry a certain genetic SNP called CYP1B1, the CG variation that causes me to poorly metabolize estrogen. So it goes down a really poor pathway and it increases my chances of having blood clots. So double that with another genetic variation I have, which is really problematic, called factor V Liodin, which is a blood clotting problem where I have a 40% higher chance of having a blood clot. Put that together and estrogen becomes something extremely dangerous to me that I did not understand. Double put on top of that, I'm jet setting across the country to do the largest book tour of my life, the Hot Detox Tour, where I did 52 tour stops. I'm flying 5 hours from Vancouver back to Ontario. And I decide, oh, it's time to go to the spa to relax. So now I'm dehydrated, head to the spa, and going from extreme hot into a cold, like a plunge to help cool off, I end up having a potential, they think it's a SCAD, and that causes me to have profound symptoms. Like the room was spinning, the heart was racing, I had extreme nausea, I couldn't stand up straight. And when they looked at my actual heart rhythm, they realized there was something terribly wrong. So I just want women to know this because everyone thinks that the bioidentical estrogen is like a fait accompli good decision, and not everyone metabolizes estrogen correctly. So that's why I do really agree with genetic testing to see whether you're a good candidate before you jump on board. And I had to manage my blood sugar beautifully to help heal my heart. So that's where a lot of the motivation to become sugar-free, even at a higher level, because once you have heart inflammation, it's your entire life's purpose to get back on track. Because let's face it, 1 in 3 people will die of heart disease. So even though I'm consider myself one of the healthier people I know, those health crises can really bring you to your knees and make you very humble. So I've never really talked about it much, but with you, I just feel like this is a really important message to get out to the world.
I agree, and I thank you so much for being open and sharing. Julie, do you have any idea how many people might have a genetic variation that would make them susceptible to taking estrogen?
Yeah, I don't have exact numbers, but I just know that it's really great to know what your genes look like. Like my husband, when he had it tested, he realized he has to avoid all sugars because he carries the ApoE gene variation that causes Alzheimer's, and his grandma died of Alzheimer's. So he's like, oh my gosh, now he keeps his blood sugar perfectly balanced. Like I'm talking 4 all the time. And he uses the sauna constantly so that he can really give himself the best shot at avoiding that genetically loaded gun. Remember, our genes might be a loaded gun, but our lifestyle and our nutrition is what really pulls the trigger. So just to give everyone inspiration that you don't have to be living the potential of what your parents lived through or your grandparents lived through. That's the beauty of being in this time, is that we can know what our weaknesses are and strengthen up that Achilles heel before it manifests.
And for you, Julie, how long were you taking the bioidentical estrogen before, you had this heart issue?
I was on it for about 9 months.
Okay, so it's not something that necessarily will happen right away.
I think it was the compound interest of all the problems. The biggest reason why you would have an issue like that is the long haul flight, the stress. And I have two issues, not just one. Factor V Leiden, everyone should be checked for Factor V Leiden, I believe, because are you needing to be on natural blood thinners to help you ensure? Now I, constantly am taking turmeric and omega-3, and there's so much goodness. Ginkgo biloba, there's wonderful natural ways to keep your platelets from sticking together.
Well, let's go a little more granular. You mentioned a few things there. Let's talk about some of the things that you started to include to heal your heart. And then also now that you include to, keep your blood thin and maintain it.
Pycnogenol is amazing. That's another thing that's extremely healing. CoQ10 is fantastic. And the great thing about CoQ10, it also really helps your mitochondria work better. So I noticed I was just more energized and had better strength training capacity. And in the early days, I had to be very careful with the amount of fitness that I took on. So I also want to bring up something that very few people know about, and that is if your heart races when you stand up or you feel like you're totally exercise intolerant, you may be dealing with something called POTS. Have you ever heard of POTS?
I've heard of it, but I don't know what it is.
It's a really big thing that it's happening to a lot of women because it can be autoimmune related, it can be really cardiovascular related, it can be trauma related. It's being stuck in fight or flight, like an autonomic nervous system issue that prevents your blood vessels from constricting. So you end up with blood pooling in your legs. And when you stand up, your heart starts racing and you feel dreadful. Your blood pressure drops and you feel really like, which I still have to be careful of. And therefore, it's the long name for it is the postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. And that's why I take such good care of my adrenals. And I just want to give message to any lady out there who thinks I can't exercise and my heart will race. I feel absolutely dreadful. Really address your nervous system and turn off fight or flight. Get out of your sympathetic nervous response, relax and digest in that parasympathetic nervous system, and you'll be shocked at how much better you feel. And that's, I think, the reason why I put all of that in my new book, because I want people to know that you can turn off fight or flight and feel that happy-go-lucky place.
And Julie, after experiencing this heart issue, I can assume that it would have been intimidating and you must have been, you know, a bit cautious getting back into an exercise routine. So I'm curious, how long did it take for you to get back into working out? And how did you do that in a careful, safe way?
I took at least 6 months, and the first thing I did was get back to my passion, which is swimming. Because the nice thing is POTS is totally eliminated when you're laying face down in the water because your blood is even across your whole body. So there was no racing of my heart. And it's just so supportive, right? So please get into any sort of water. And then if you can't do that, then at least getting on a stationary bike where you're able to just gently work at your own pace within your own capabilities. And yoga was a big part of my healing because then you're switching on your parasympathetic and relaxing and really breathing through it is absolutely fantastic. So my brother, being a yoga instructor, certainly helped to give me all those tools and help me also have more reserve when it comes to looking at food. I'm like, I got better ways to deal with stress now when you turn off that. It's really cool how you can manually switch off your fight or flight using anything that tickles the vagus nerve that runs from your brain into your belly. You can manually stimulate it through humming. So if you hum like a bee or sing or chant, that's one of the great manual ways to switch off fight or flight.
Yeah, I really love that part of the book, talking about stimulating the vagus nerve. And another thing you talk about is that you could gargle. I'd love for you to talk more about how somebody could incorporate, one or some of the things you just named into a healthy routine. Like, how often do they do it? Is it something they just do when they're stressed? And get more granular on what the impact that's having on somebody's system.
Sure. So the vagus nerve, I love to say whatever happens in Vegas stays in Vegas because it really does come down to if we can stimulate the vagus nerve, we move ourselves from the fight or flight into that rest and digest. And we can also do things like just embracing good amounts of omega-3 can help to relax that. Increasing the fermented foods, having good probiotics actually helps us relax. And also another one that may surprise people is having manual adjustments. So I think it's really cool. You formally practiced the active release technique, and anything like that where you're having manual stimulation can be very helpful. I love having osteopathic appointments as well. That touch is so helpful to truly downregulate our nervous system and help get us back into that rest and digest, the parasympathetic mode. I think another thing I just want to explain to people is that, did you know when your fight or flight is switched on, you're become very light sensitive because your pupils dilate to help you run away from a bear or a lion in the middle of the night. So your night vision goes up, but unfortunately that really hurts you during the day. But it also switches off your peristalsis. So your bile flow goes down, your digestive juices go down, but also your bowel peristalsis stops. So people get really constipated. 1 in 3 people live chronically constipated. So if we could just get you stimulated and have that lovely parasympathetic take over, all of a sudden you'll notice that your digestive system moves again. So really up that probiotic fiber and have lots of omega-3 liquid, because that works as a gentle movement, really helps reduce constipation and switch on our parasympathetic.
And would you say doing these exercises that we talked about and that you outlined in the book, is this something that people should take on as part of their like day-to-day healthy routine or just do when they're in a stressful environment or situation?
I like to do it daily, but I know that we have to habit stack because 45% of what we do in a day is habitual. So you can't like change everything so radically all at once. But if you can put those little habits in, I like to start streaks so that we can build a habit and then it takes over and becomes a norm. And then we put in another habit. So just changing how we breathe can be a huge piece. So breathing in for 5 and exhaling for 10 knocks us out of fight or flight. And that's something that's free. You can do it in a bank lineup. Like, it's so easy to do. And even just running yourself a nice warm bath and putting some essential oils in there can also just switch off the fight or flight. So whatever you're attracted to, we just want to find any way we can to switch off fight or flight. That's a big piece in healing our emotional relationship to food and also helping our entire body work better.
And now that it's been 5 or 6 years, you've taken such good care of your body. Well, continue to. I mean, you've been taking good care of your body for a long time, but you've been focused in on, healing and taking good care of your heart. Do you feel like it's back at the level it was before you had the heart issue, or where's that at?
Well, I feel my strength training is better than it's ever been. So now I can seriously lift some good weight off the floor. Like, my deadlifts are getting better than ever. But I will say that with my heart, I just have to be careful to avoid the POTS. And I do that through actually a number of things to help knock me out of fight or flight. The last one I'll mention for really tough cases is if you stimulate your vagus nerve with a TENS machine. There's actually a clip you can use on your ear that knocks me out of fight or flight immediately. And that's like my final sort of ultimate way to make sure that I stimulate that vagus nerve. And that's when I'm like, okay, I'm completely normal. So I'm not bulletproof yet, but I'm moving in the right direction. And I'm starting to feel like I'm doing everything I can to reach that ultimate health.
Well, Julie, you've alluded to this a couple times that over the last, relatively recent period of time, I know you and your husband Alan have really ramped up your exercise routine. So talk about what spurred that on. I'm assuming it's, now that your heart's doing better and you can do that. But talk about the catalyst there and how the impact that's had on your well-being.
Well, after my cardiac event, I realized I had to rehab my heart, but I also was getting up there and realizing that most women end up having their metabolism slow to a halt around 50, and they lose their muscle mass, which is what really causes us to be exercise intolerant and to age very poorly. So I'm like, not on my watch. I want to be stronger than ever. So I took it on a serious mission to up my protein. So now I eat up to 100 grams of protein a day, and I weight train 3 times a week in order to make sure I don't lose that muscle mass, because sarcopenia is the robber of health. And that's what really also I realized I had so much to live for. When you almost lose your health twice, you realize that it's so precious and there is no dress rehearsal. And I wanted to be able to climb Kilimanjaro with my husband. I wanted to free dive. Now I can hold my breath for multiple minutes at a time. And that only comes when you flex that muscle and make sure to hold on to it and make it your absolute focus. And I promise that when you focus on your health, it's the gateway to everything you want to create in your entire life. If you want more energy, if you want better relationships, if you want a better career, if you want better positive moods, like focus on getting healthy. And I promise the rest of the world opens up to you.
It's foundational.
Totally.
And Julie talked about there how, having these different health crises in your life has really, sharpened you up to being in the present moment and really living life to the max. And, this most recent one with your heart, it's now been 5 or 6 years. And it sounds like that's something you've, kept close and kept present and are living day in, day out, which is incredible. How does somebody who, hasn't necessarily had that experience where their health has gotten to that point of, something severe happening, or somebody that has, but then they're a period of time away from that and now they're, they've gotten lax about a lot of things. How do you make sure you're bringing that to the forefront day in, day out so you are continuing to live your life to the max?
I think the big piece is to imagine life 5 years out. If you were to do what you're doing now, what is the almost certain future? So if you can imagine, okay, if I'm gaining 8 pounds a year and my health is breaking down, imagine where will I be? And then imagine it another 5 years out. And you start to see like the sharp decrease. And then we start to imagine, ah, my parents, my grandparents, trade places with them. Imagine what it feels like to be in a body that cannot move anymore, a brain that cannot function anymore, that you can't put the words together, that you can't even connect the dots. And if you can imagine that for a moment and trade places and be compassionate, you'd be shocked at how present you are to the need for you to attend to your health right now. Because it wasn't until I had like food poisoning that nearly killed me and then a heart event that had me realize, gosh, I have to take this to the next level, that allowed me to understand what's coming. Because it's so easy to say, mañana, I'll do it tomorrow. And if we can say, actually, I want Olympic health later, and I'm willing to actually do what I need to do today to make that happen, then you actually have an extraordinary life now. Because I wanted a beautiful life right now. And that's one thing that shocks me. It's just I have more joy now. I might be building for the future, but I'm actually depositing so much good juice and having good dopamine receptors and my serotonin flowing that I get along with people and I feel relaxed and connected and energetic and open and free. And isn't that what we all want? Right? What are we doing this for if we can't have fun?
I love that. And a tool that I often talk about on the show because it's a powerful one for me, and I don't know how I initially fell into it, but I like to think about the end of my life. I like to think about death. I basically do it on a daily basis. And again, I always caveat it, not in a grotesque kind of way, but I think, this is a way for people and this just came to me after I asked you how somebody could do this if they hadn't had a serious health issue, and because a lot of times it takes that for people to sharpen their pencil and really start to focus in on being in the present and living the max each and every day. But I find like for me, I can use that as a tool to realize that, life is short, you know, and thinking about that and then coming back to the present moment is just so powerful.
I completely agree. And the Buddhists and the Stoics, I really do believe in Stoicism. And they believe that when you are very conscious to the end of our life, you end up with radical gratitude. And Jesse, I just want to acknowledge you as one of my greatest friends for practicing radical gratitude, because being around you is like authentically effervescent because you just exude this presence of gratitude. And I know a lot of people are paying lip service to gratitude, but when you pull it into each moment and really go, wow, this is working, this is working, you'd be amazed at how that pops all your neurochemistry, and you just have greater levels of happiness. So thank you for that, for being so present.
Well, thank you for being so kind. And we'll end on this, although it is pretty cliche, it's important to bring up the fact that time does fly. I mean, we're talking about 2016 when you had your heart incident, and to me that seems like yesterday, being your friend for, well beyond that. But it's like, time is going by so quickly, and it's like have that conversation you need to have with somebody. Get real, get present with the people closest to you in your life, and just live each and every day to the max.
Absolutely, Jesse, because one thing we love doing is having real conversations, and in those there's so much juice and joy that food is just, it's just like a sideline show. The real show's happening when we love and connect with people.
Well, coming back to what you said before, food is the foundation for everything. So food just allows us to have the energy, be present, and to live our lives to the max. So coming full circle there, Julie, I really appreciate, going so deep into your whole health journey and being so open about, your health challenge with your heart a number of years back. And I just think it's so important everything you shared, and congrats on the latest book. It's fabulous, and I'm just so honored to be a close friend of yours and to be able to have this conversation with you. So thank you.
Oh, thank you, Jesse. You really are a gem, and everything you do is so authentic. So I'm incredibly grateful to you. Thank you.
Back at you. Thank you.